They called her nothing, and by morning, they would not dare say her name out loud. But that night, inside a low-roof saloon that smelled of cheap whiskey, dust, and old wood baked under 100 Texas suns, she was just the girl who carried drinks and kept her eyes down. And Ethan Cole noticed her the way a man notices something out of place without knowing why, not because she was loud or beautiful in the way men in that room like to talk about, but because she moved differently, quiet, measured, like every step had already been decided long before she took it. And when someone laughed too hard at her for spilling a drop of bourbon, she didn't flinch, didn't apologize the way the others would have. She simply wiped the table, steady hands, steady breath, as if the noise around her belonged to another world entirely. And that was the first thing that made Ethan stop his drink halfway to his lips, because out here, in a town that barely held together between drought and rumor, everyone reacted to something: fear, anger, pride. But not her. Never her. She carried herself like someone who didn't need the town to accept her, and that alone was enough to make men uncomfortable. The piano in the corner stumbled through a tune that had lost its rhythm hours ago. Boots scraped against the floor, voices rose and fell like wind through broken boards, and still she moved through it untouched, a shadow that served drinks, collected coins, and said almost nothing, until a man at the far end of the bar reached out. Not rough, not kind either, just careless, the kind of gesture that comes from believing the world belongs to you. His fingers brushed her wrist as she set down a glass, and the room leaned in without realizing it, waiting, because moments like that always turned into something more in places like this. But she didn't pull away fast, didn't snap, didn't plead. She simply looked at him, and that look carried something older than the town, older than the men who built it, something that made the man hesitate, just for a second, just long enough for Ethan to notice the shift. And Ethan had seen that look before, not in a saloon, not in a place filled with laughter that didn't mean anything, but out in open land where silence held weight, where a glance could say more than words ever could. And he set his glass down slow, the sound of it touching wood cutting through the noise sharper than it should have. And he stood, not in a rush, not looking for trouble, just standing because something in his chest told him that if he stayed seated, he'd regret it longer than any fight could last. The man at the bar glanced up, annoyed more than anything. And Ethan didn't raise his voice, didn't make a show of it. He just said, "Let her go," like it wasn't a request, like it was something already decided. And for a moment, the whole room held its breath. The piano stopped, someone near the door shifted their weight, and the man let go, not because he was afraid, but because something in the air had changed in a way he couldn't explain. And the girl stepped back, her wrist free, her expression the same as before, calm, untouched, as if none of it mattered. And she looked at Ethan then, really looked at him, and there was no gratitude in it, no relief, just recognition, like she had been expecting him to stand, like this moment had already happened somewhere else before either of them arrived here. And Ethan felt that look settle into him in a way that made no sense, because he had never seen her before, never spoken to her. And yet it felt like he had just stepped into the middle of something that had been moving long before he walked through those doors. She turned away, without a word, continued her work as if nothing had happened. But the room didn't return to normal, not quite. Conversations came back slower, quieter, like people were speaking around something they couldn't name. And Ethan sat down again, picked up his drink, but it didn't taste the same. Nothing did, because now he was watching her with a different kind of attention. Noticing the way others avoided standing too close to her without knowing why, noticing the small detail at her neck, a thin cord, barely visible against her skin, holding something that caught the light only when she turned just right, a piece of silver, worn, marked with patterns he didn't recognize but felt like he should. And every now and then, she would pause, just for a breath, her eyes lifting toward the door as if listening for something no one else could hear. And that was when Ethan realized this wasn't about a waitress, wasn't about a quiet girl working for tips in a forgotten town. This was something else entirely, something the town hadn't seen yet, something that was already on its way, and somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the lantern light and the smell of whiskey. The night shifted, carrying with it the faint, distant rhythm of hooves that hadn't reached the town, not yet. The sound did not belong to the town. That was the first thing Ethan understood. Because in a place like this, every noise had a name, boots on wood, wind through cracks, a horse tied too tight outside. But this was different, low and distant, like thunder that had not decided whether it would arrive or not. And the girl heard it too. He saw it in the way her hand paused just above a glass, not shaking, not afraid, just waiting, as if the night itself had spoken to her, and she was the only one who understood the language. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes narrowing, listening harder, but the others went on talking, laughing, arguing about cattle prices and dry wells, none of them noticing the shift that had already begun, because men only hear what they expect to hear, and nothing about that sound fit into anything they knew. The girl moved again, setting the glass down, turning just enough that the silver piece at her neck caught the lantern light, and for a second it flashed, not bright, not sharp, just enough to draw the eye. And Ethan felt something pull at his memory, something half-buried, like a word you almost remember but cannot say out loud. He had seen markings like that once, years ago, carved into stone far from any road, back when he still rode with men who believed land could be claimed just because you could stand on it. He had not understood it then, and he did not understand it now, but it meant something, something that did not belong. Inside a saloon, the bartender grunted for her to hurry, sliding another bottle across the counter, and she obeyed, quiet, efficient, but there was a change now, small enough that no one else noticed. Her steps were no longer just measured, they were timed, like she was counting something no one else could see, seconds maybe, or distance. Ethan could not tell, only that she was no longer simply moving through the room. She was preparing, and that thought sat heavy in his chest, because preparation meant something was coming, and he did not like not knowing what that something was. The man from earlier muttered under his breath, rubbing his wrist as if the memory of her touch had left something behind, and a couple of others glanced toward the door without knowing why. The air inside the room had changed, thicker somehow, like the moment before a storm when everything feels too still, and then it came again, clearer this time. The rhythm of hooves, not fast, not frantic, steady, controlled, many of them, more than a handful, enough that the ground outside would be feeling it already. Even if the men inside refused to admit it, Ethan stood again, slower. This time, not because he intended to act, but because something in him refused to stay seated when the world shifted like that. He moved a few steps toward the door, pushing it open just enough to let the night in, and the air outside carried the truth with it. Dust rising in the distance, faint but undeniable, a line moving across the horizon where no line should be. Riders, more than he could count from here, maybe 20, maybe more, moving as one, not scattered like traders or travelers, but together, deliberate, and he felt his jaw tighten, because men who rode like that did not come for drinks or conversation. They came with purpose, and purpose out here rarely meant anything simple. Behind him, the room began to notice, chairs shifting, voices lowering, someone asking what was going on, but no one stepping forward yet. Not wanting to be the first to admit something was wrong, Ethan stepped back inside, letting the door fall half closed, and his eyes went straight to her. Because somehow he knew this had something to do with her, and she was already looking at him, not surprised, not afraid, just certain, like the sound outside had confirmed something she had been waiting for all along. She took one slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling with a calm that did not belong in a room about to change. And then she did something small, something that would have meant nothing to anyone else. She reached up and adjusted the cord at her neck, letting the silver piece rest openly against her chest instead of hiding beneath the fabric. And the moment she did, the air seemed to settle around her in a way Ethan could not explain, like a line had been drawn that no one else could see. The bartender frowned, about to say something, but stopped, the words dying before they formed. Because even he felt it now, that quiet pressure, that sense that something larger than the room had just stepped inside without making a sound. The hooves outside grew louder, closer, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat, and for the first time, the men in the saloon fell completely silent, not because they understood what was coming, but because something in them recognized that whatever it was, it did not belong to them, and Ethan stood there, caught between the door and the girl, realizing with a slow, heavy certainty that he had been wrong from the very beginning. Not about the men in the room, not about the town, but about her, because she had never been part of any of it. Not really, and whatever was arriving outside was not coming for the town, it was coming for her. The first rider stopped just short of the saloon, and that was when the silence outside became louder than any noise inside. Because 20 horses do not simply arrive without purpose, and 20 men do not sit that still unless they have already decided how the night will end. Ethan felt it before he saw it. That shift in the air when control leaves a place without asking permission. The kind of stillness that does not come from peace, but from certainty. He stepped fully outside now, boots pressing into dry earth that had not seen rain in weeks, the dust rising faint beneath him, and across the open stretch between the buildings and the road, they waited, lined in a loose arc, not blocking the town, not threatening it either, just present. And that presence alone carried more weight than any weapon ever could. Their faces were calm, unreadable, their posture straight but not rigid, like men who had nothing to prove. And no reason to rush. And Ethan counted without meaning to 1, 5, 10, more, at least 24 riders, each one spaced just enough to move if needed, but not moving, not yet. Behind him, the door creaked as a few men from inside gathered the courage to step out, drawn by the same pull that had brought him, but none of them spoke, because words would have felt wrong here, like trying to name something that did not belong to language. The lead rider shifted slightly in his saddle, not forward, not back, just enough to catch the light. And Ethan noticed the markings then, not paint meant to frighten, not decoration meant to impress, but symbols worn with the kind of quiet pride that does not ask for recognition. And something inside Ethan settled, not into comfort, but into understanding. This was not a raid, not a warning, not a negotiation. This was something else entirely, something the town had no place in. And that realization made him glance back toward the saloon door. Because he already knew where this was leading, she stepped out then, not hurried, not hesitant, just walking, the same way she had moved all night, steady, deliberate, as if the ground itself adjusted to meet her steps. And the moment she crossed the threshold, the air shifted again, not in a way that could be heard or seen, but felt, like the space between two heartbeats stretching just enough to make you aware of it. The men behind Ethan straightened without knowing why. One of them removed his hat slowly, not out of respect he understood, but because something in him told him it was the right thing to do. She did not look at them, not at the town, not at the men who had spent hours ignoring her existence. She looked only ahead, toward the riders, and Ethan watched as the lead man dismounted, smooth, controlled, his boots touching the ground with a softness that carried no urgency. And then he stepped forward a few paces and stopped, not approaching her further, not calling out, just waiting. The distance between them measured not in feet, but in meaning, and for a moment, nothing happened. No one spoke, no one moved, and the silence deepened into something almost sacred, the kind of quiet that makes a man aware of his own breathing, his own weight, his own place in the world. And then, slowly, the rider lowered his head, not a bow forced by fear, not a gesture meant to appease, but something older, something chosen, and one by one, without signal, without command, the others followed, each rider inclining their head in the same measured way, until the entire line stood in stillness, not facing a threat, but acknowledging something they already knew. And Ethan felt his chest tighten as the truth settled in, heavy and undeniable, because no one bows like that for a servant. No one crosses miles of dry land to stand in silence for someone who does not matter. And the girl, the one they had called nothing, stood there without changing, without reacting the way anyone else would have. She did not smile, did not speak. She simply accepted it, as if this was not a surprise, but a return. And for the first time, Ethan understood that everything he had seen before, every small detail he had dismissed, every quiet moment he had not questioned, had been leading to this. Not a reveal shouted across the room, but a truth shown in silence. And she turned her head then, just slightly, her eyes finding his again, and in that look there was no apology, no explanation, just a quiet acknowledgement, like she was offering him the same understanding she had carried all along. And Ethan stood there, dust at his boots, the town behind him, the riders before him, realizing that the world he thought he understood had just shifted without asking his permission. And somewhere deep in that realization, He knew that this was only the beginning of something far larger than a single night in a forgotten town. No one told the riders to bow, and no one told them to rise. Yet when the moment passed, they lifted their heads as one, not in haste, not in hesitation, but with the same quiet certainty that had brought them there. And the lead man took another step forward, stopping again at a respectful distance, his gaze never leaving hers. And when he spoke, his voice carried low, steady, not meant for the town, not meant for anyone except her, words in a language Ethan did not understand, yet somehow felt like hearing a melody without knowing the meaning behind it. And she answered just as softly, her voice no louder than the wind brushing against dry wood. But the effect was immediate. The men behind Ethan shifted, not out of fear, but out of discomfort, because they were witnessing something they had no place in, something that did not belong to their rules or their understanding. And Ethan stood there, caught between wanting to step closer and knowing he should not, because whatever this was, it had nothing to do with him, and yet everything inside him refused to turn away. She moved then, one step forward, closing part of the distance, and the silver piece at her neck caught the light again, clearer now, the markings sharper, and Ethan felt that same pull in his memory, stronger this time, like a door almost opening. He had seen symbols like that carved into canyon walls years ago, places no map had named, places men passed through without stopping because they could not understand what they were seeing, and now it stood before him, not carved in stone, but worn by someone the town had dismissed as invisible. The lead rider reached into his coat slowly, carefully, drawing out something wrapped in cloth, not in a threatening way, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that carried purpose, and he unfolded it with deliberate care, revealing a small object, weathered, worn smooth by time, and even from where he stood, Ethan could tell it mattered, not for its size, but for what it represented. The man held it out with both hands, not offering it like a trade, but presenting it, and she stepped closer again, taking it without hesitation, her fingers closing around it with a familiarity that spoke of something long before this night. And for the first time, her expression shifted, not into a smile, not into relief, but into something deeper, something that carried both weight and memory. And Ethan realized then that this was not a meeting, not a reunion. This was a return, something that had been set in motion long ago finally reaching its place. The men behind him began to murmur, low, uncertain, trying to make sense of what they were seeing, but their voices felt small against the stillness of the moment, and one of them whispered, asking who she was, but no one answered, because no one knew, not really. And Ethan felt that question settle into him, heavier than the others, because he had been the closest to her, had watched her all night, had stood when others laughed, and still, he had not seen it, had not understood what stood right in front of him, and that realization carried a quiet weight, not sharp, not sudden, but steady, like something that would not leave once it arrived. She turned slightly then, not away from the riders, but just enough to look back toward the town, toward the men who had filled the room with noise hours before, and her gaze passed over them without stopping, not judging, not condemning, just seeing them for what they were. And then it reached Ethan again, and this time, there was something more in it, not gratitude, not recognition alone, but a kind of acknowledgement that felt almost like an invitation, not to follow, not to speak, but simply to understand. And he felt his breath catch, because for the first time, he realized that this moment was not just about who she was, but about what he would choose to see, whether he would hold on to the version of the world he knew, or step into something that did not fit within it. And the lead rider spoke again, a single phrase this time, shorter, firmer, and she nodded, just once, the movement small but final, like a decision that had already been made long before this night began. She stepped back then, turning fully toward them, and as she did, the line of riders shifted, not breaking formation, but opening, creating a path where there had been none. And Ethan felt that same quiet certainty settle deeper in his chest, because now he understood. They had not come to take her, they had come to receive her, and the difference between those two things was larger than anything the town could measure. She took one step forward into that opening, then paused, just for a breath, just long enough for the night to hold itself still again. And Ethan stood there, knowing without being told that whatever came next would change more than just the way he saw her. It would change the way he saw everything that came after. She did not rush the step, and that was what stayed with Ethan the most, not the riders. Not the silence, but the way she moved into that space as if it had always belonged to her. Like she was not leaving something behind, but returning to where she had been expected all along. And the town, for all its noise and pride and dust-covered certainty, seemed to shrink around that single motion, because suddenly it was clear that none of this had ever been about them. Not their rules, not their judgments, not even their presence. And Ethan felt that truth settle heavy in his chest. Not like a blow, but like something undeniable, something that could not be argued away or ignored. She took another step, then another, until she stood within the line of riders, and still no one spoke. Not a command, not a greeting. Only the sound of leather shifting, of horses breathing slow and steady under the weight of men who did not need to prove anything. And the lead rider stepped aside just enough to let her pass fully through, not turning his back, not lowering his guard, but making space with a kind of respect that Ethan had never seen given so freely. And she walked forward until she stood at the center of them. And only then did the formation change, subtle but complete, the arc closing around her, not trapping, not surrounding, but aligning, like pieces of something that had finally found their place. And Ethan realized that what he was watching was not an arrival. It was a recognition, something being acknowledged by those who had known it long before he ever had. And the object she held now, the one the rider had given her, rested in her palm, and for a brief moment she looked down at it, her fingers tracing its surface as if reading something written there, something no one else could see. And then she lifted it slightly, just enough for the nearest riders to see, and a quiet ripple passed through them. Not sound, not movement, but understanding, shared and immediate. And Ethan felt that same pull again, stronger than before, that sense that this moment reached further back than he could grasp, tied to places he had only glimpsed in passing, to stories he had never taken the time to hear. And he found himself taking a step forward without thinking, not enough to join them, not enough to interrupt, but enough to close the distance between himself and the edge of whatever this was. And she saw it. Of course she did, her head turning slightly, her gaze meeting his once more, and this time there was something different in it, something softer, not in weakness, but in clarity, like she was seeing him not as he stood in that moment, but as he might become if he chose to understand what stood before him. And that look held him there, steady, unmoving, while everything else seemed to shift. Around them, the riders began to turn then, not all at once, not in a rush, but one by one, aligning themselves with the path they had come from, their horses responding without hesitation, as if they too understood that the purpose of the journey had been fulfilled. And the lead rider mounted again, smooth and controlled, his eyes never leaving her, waiting, not commanding, and she gave a small nod, barely more than a breath of movement. And that was enough. The line began to move, slow at first, then steady, the rhythm of hooves returning, but different now, no longer distant, no longer approaching, but leaving, carrying something with them that had never truly belonged to the town. And Ethan stood there, watching as she walked alongside them, not ahead, not behind, but among them, exactly where she should be. And with every step she took away from the saloon, from the lantern light, from the world that had tried to fit her into something smaller, the truth became clearer. She had never been what they thought, not even close. And the mistake had not been in who she was, but in what they had chosen to see. The town remained silent long after the riders had passed beyond the edge of sight, long after the dust had settled back into the ground, and no one moved to speak, because there was nothing to say that would not sound small compared to what they had just witnessed. And Ethan finally let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding, his eyes still fixed on the horizon where they had disappeared. And in that quiet, he understood something he had not known before, that sometimes the world does not reveal its truth through noise or force, but through moments like this, quiet, undeniable, leaving no room for doubt. And as he turned slightly, ready to step back into the life he thought he knew, he realized with a slow, certain weight that nothing about that life would feel the same again. Because once a man sees the truth standing right in front of him, he does not get to pretend he missed it. The town did not move for a long while after the riders disappeared. as if the dust they left behind had settled not only on the ground but inside every man standing there. And Ethan remained where he was, boots planted in the same dry earth, eyes fixed on the horizon long after there was nothing left to see. Because something in him refused to accept that it was over, not in the way things usually ended out here, not with a final word or a clear line drawn between what came before and what would follow. This had ended quietly, almost gently, and that was what made it harder to walk away from. The man beside him shifted first, clearing his throat as if trying to break the silence. But the sound fell flat, meaningless, and he stepped back toward the saloon without saying a word. One by one the others followed, not looking at each other, not speaking, each carrying something they could not quite name. And Ethan felt the pull to return with them, to step back into the familiar rhythm of voices and glasses and small talk that filled the hours between sunrise and sleep. But his feet did not move, because the version of that place he had known no longer fit the way it used to. Not after what he had just seen. He lowered his gaze to the ground for a moment, noticing the faint tracks left behind. The imprint of hooves pressed into the dirt, and he crouched slightly, running his fingers along one of them without thinking, as if touching it might anchor the moment in something real, something he could hold on to. And the earth was still warm, still carrying the weight of what had passed through it. And that simple detail made everything feel more certain, not imagined, not exaggerated, but true, completely and undeniably true. He straightened slowly, exhaling a breath that felt heavier than it should have, and turned back toward the saloon, pushing the door open with less force than before. And inside, the room had changed, not in its shape or its smell. The same lantern light flickered against the same worn tables. The same bottles lined the shelves behind the bar, but the noise was gone, replaced by something quieter, more cautious, as if every word now carried the risk of sounding wrong. The bartender wiped a glass that did not need cleaning, his movements slower than usual, and a couple of men sat with their drinks untouched, staring into them as if expecting answers to surface from the amber liquid. Ethan stepped inside fully, letting the door close behind him, and for a moment, no one acknowledged him, not out of disrespect, but because no one quite knew how to begin speaking again. And he walked back to his place at the bar, the same stool, the same spot where everything had started, and he rested his hands against the wood, feeling the rough grain beneath his palms, grounding himself in something familiar. The bartender glanced up, meeting his eyes briefly, and there was a question there, unspoken, something like, "Did you understand it? Did you see what that was?" But neither of them said anything, because the answer would not have fit into words anyway. Ethan reached for his glass, lifting it slowly, but he did not drink right away. He just held it there, watching the way the light caught the surface, the way it shifted with the smallest movement. And he realized that he was not thinking about the drink at all. He was thinking about her, about the way she had looked at him at the end, not asking, not expecting, just offering something he had not been ready to receive until that moment. And he set the glass back down without taking a sip, because it no longer felt like something he needed. The room remained quiet, but not empty, not anymore, because now it carried something else, something that had not been there before, a kind of awareness, fragile but real, that the world outside their small town was larger than they had allowed themselves to believe. And Ethan turned his head slightly, looking toward the door again, half expecting it to open, half knowing it would not. And in that space between expectation and certainty, he understood something that settled deep, steady, and unshakable, that the night had not ended with her leaving. It had only shifted, moved beyond the reach of the town, continuing somewhere out there where the land stretched wide and the rules were written differently. And he wondered, not for the first time, what it would mean to follow that path, not out of curiosity alone, but out of something closer to purpose. And the thought stayed with him, quiet, persistent, like the echo of hooves long after the sound had faded, reminding him that some moments are not meant to be left behind, no matter how far you try to walk away from them. Morning came slower than it should have, or maybe it only felt that way because Ethan had not truly slept, the kind of night that leaves a man staring at the ceiling while thoughts move like distant thunder, never loud enough to break, but never quiet enough to ignore. And when the first light slipped through the cracks of his small room above the stable, it carried no answers, Only the same quiet weight that had followed him since the riders vanished into the dark. He rose without thinking much about it, pulling on his boots, the leather stiff from dust and long use, and stepped outside where the air still held the cool edge of dawn. The town looked the same, buildings standing where they always had, fences leaning the same way, the same dry stretch of road cutting through it all. But something had shifted beneath that surface, something no one would speak about, yet everyone felt. A few men were already moving about, slower than usual, their voices low, as if the night had taken something from them they had not agreed to give. Ethan walked past them without stopping, not out of rudeness, but because he knew there was nothing they could say that would reach what was turning in his mind. His steps carried him back to the edge of town, to the place where the riders had stood, and the tracks were still there, faint now, softened by the breeze, but not gone, and he followed them with his eyes first, then with his feet, one step at a time, not in a hurry, not chasing, just moving in the direction that felt unavoidable. The land opened quickly beyond the last building, stretching wide and quiet under the early light, and the trail they left behind cut through it like a line drawn with purpose, not wandering, not uncertain, and Ethan paused there, just beyond the reach of the town, where the sounds of it faded into nothing, and for a moment, he stood between two worlds, one behind him, familiar, small, defined by rules he had never questioned until now, and one ahead, open, unknown, shaped by something he had only glimpsed for a single night, and that was enough. Enough to make staying feel like a kind of blindness he could no longer accept. He looked down again, noticing something he had missed in the dark, a smaller set of impressions alongside the horses, lighter, more measured, her steps, and they ran steady, never breaking, never faltering, and that detail settled something inside him, because it meant she had not been taken, not led. She had walked forward on her own, exactly as she had chosen, and that choice carried more weight than anything else he had seen. He straightened slowly, lifting his gaze toward the horizon where the land dipped and rose in long, quiet waves, and he could almost imagine them still moving out there, the steady rhythm of hooves, the silence that surrounded them, the purpose that guided every step. And for the first time since the night began, Ethan allowed himself to ask the question he had been avoiding, not who she was, because that answer had already been given without words, but what he was supposed to do now that he had seen it, because seeing something changes a man, whether he admits it or not, and ignoring it does not return him to what he was before. It only leaves him standing in a place that no longer fits. He glanced back once, over his shoulder, toward the town, the roofs catching the morning light, the faint movement of people beginning their day as if nothing had changed, and he felt no anger toward them, no judgment, only a quiet understanding that they would continue as they always had, because they had not stepped outside the line they had drawn for themselves. But he had, even if only for a moment, and that moment was enough. He turned forward again, the decision settling into him not as something dramatic, not as a sudden leap, but as something steady, inevitable, like a path that had been there all along, waiting for him to notice it. And he took another step, then another, following the trail not as a man chasing something lost, but as a man moving towards something he had finally begun to understand, and somewhere ahead, beyond what he could see, the story that had only just revealed its first truth was still unfolding, carrying with it an answer he had not yet earned, but could no longer ignore. The trail did not fade as quickly as Ethan expected, and that alone told him more than he needed to know, because men who ride without purpose leave scattered marks, broken lines that wander and disappear. But this path held steady, cutting across the land with quiet intention, and he followed it at a measured pace, not pushing, not slowing, letting his steps fall into a rhythm that matched the silence around him. The sun climbed higher, pulling the chill from the air, and the wide stretch of land unfolded in front of him, dry grass bending under a light breeze, distant hills rising like shadows against the sky, and somewhere out there, beyond what he could yet see, they were still moving. He did not need to hear the hooves to know that. He could feel it, in the same way a man feels weather before it arrives, a shift in something deeper than sound. He walked for what felt like miles, though he did not count, because distance had stopped meaning what it used to. It was no longer about how far he had gone, but about how far he was willing to continue. And that question followed him with every step, not pressing, not demanding, just present, steady, like the land itself. At one point he paused near a shallow rise, looking down at the tracks more closely, and there it was again, her steps, lighter, precise, never breaking from the line, and beside them, the deeper impressions of the horses, not crowding her path, not crossing it, but moving in alignment, and that detail settled deeper in his mind, because it spoke of something he was only beginning to understand, that she had not been guided, she had been accompanied, and the difference between those two things carried weight he could not ignore. He straightened slowly, scanning the horizon again, and for a moment, there was nothing, just open land stretching into distance, and then, faintly, he saw it. Not movement at first, but a shift in the light, something that did not belong to the natural line of hills and sky. And as he narrowed his eyes, it took shape, small at that distance, but distinct enough to recognize. Riders, still there, still moving, not hurried, not fading, just continuing, and something in his chest tightened, not from doubt, but from the realization that this was real, that what he had seen the night before was not an isolated moment, but part of something ongoing, something that did not end when it passed through the town. He took another step forward, then another, the distance between them closing slowly, and as he walked, he became aware of something else, a quiet presence in the land itself, not in the way of danger, not in the way of being watched, but in the sense that he was no longer alone in a place he had always believed belonged to no one. The air felt different out here, not heavier, not lighter, just aware, like stepping into a room where something important had already been decided, and you were the last to arrive. He moved up the rise, boots pressing into the dry ground, and when he reached the top, the view opened wider, the riders clearer now, their formation unchanged, their movement steady, and at the center of it, he could just make out her figure, walking as she had before, neither leading nor following, exactly where she belonged. And the sight of that brought something unexpected to him. Not relief, not even certainty, but a kind of quiet recognition, like seeing something again that had already changed you once before. And he stopped there for a moment, not because he could not go on, but because he understood that crossing this distance meant more than just closing the space between 2 points. It meant stepping fully into something he could no longer pretend to stand outside of. And he stood with that understanding, letting it settle, letting it take shape without rushing it. The wind moved softly across the land, carrying with it the faintest trace of dust, and for a brief moment, he thought of turning back, not out of fear, but out of habit, because turning back is what men do when they reach the edge of what they understand. But that thought did not hold. It passed through him the same way the wind passed over the ground, leaving nothing behind. And he realized then that there was no returning to what he had been before, not because something had been taken from him, but because something had been given, a glimpse of a world that did not fit within the lines he had lived by. And once a man sees that, truly sees it, he does not get to close his eyes and pretend it is not there. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, and then he moved forward again, not faster, not slower, just certain, following the path not as an outsider anymore, but as someone who had begun, in his own quiet way, to belong to the story that was unfolding ahead of him. The distance between them closed slowly, but not in a way that felt like pursuit. And that was what Ethan noticed first, because he had followed tracks before, had chased cattle across miles of open land, had ridden down men who did not want to be found. But this felt different. There was no urgency in his steps, no tension in his chest, only a steady pull forward, like the land itself had decided he should keep going. And as the riders ahead became clearer, their shapes sharpening against the horizon, he realized they had known he was there long before he had reached this point. Not because they turned, not because they signaled, but because nothing about their movement changed, and that told him everything. They were not surprised, they were not concerned, they were simply aware, and awareness out here carried more weight than any reaction ever could. He slowed slightly as he approached the edge of their formation, not stepping into it, not crossing a line that had not been drawn, but was clearly there, and for a moment, he stood just outside of it, feeling the difference in the air, subtle but real, like standing at the threshold of something that required more than just movement to enter. The lead rider turned his head then, just enough to acknowledge him, and their eyes met, not with challenge, not with welcome, but with something in between, something that asked a question without words, and Ethan did not answer. Not because he did not understand, but because he was not sure how. And that hesitation held him there, balanced between what he had been and what he might become. The line of riders continued forward, their pace unchanged, and she walked among them, her steps as steady as before, and for the first time since he had started following, she looked back, not over her shoulder, not in a quick glance, but fully, her gaze finding him across the space between them, and in that look there was no surprise, no confusion, only a quiet certainty, like she had expected him to come this far, and Ethan felt that recognition settle into him, not as permission, not as invitation, but as something deeper, something that suggested this path had always been open. He had simply not seen it until now. She held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she did something small, something that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. She slowed her steps, just slightly, enough to let the riders around her move a fraction ahead, creating a space beside her that had not been there before. And the meaning of that space was not spoken, not explained, but it was there, clear in a way that did not require words. Ethan felt his breath catch, because in that moment, the choice became real, not in theory, not in thought, but in action. Step forward and cross into something unknown, or remain where he was and carry the memory of this moment for the rest of his life. And the weight of that decision pressed against him, not harsh, not urgent, but undeniable. He looked down briefly at the ground between them, at the faint line that marked where his steps ended and theirs began, and he understood that this was not about distance. It was about understanding, about whether he could leave behind the certainty of what he had known for something he could not yet define. And he lifted his gaze again, meeting hers once more, and in that look, he found no demand, no expectation, only the same quiet presence she had carried from the beginning. And that was what made the decision for him. Not force, not pressure, but the absence of both. He stepped forward, one measured step, crossing that unseen line, and the moment his foot settled into the path they had been walking, something shifted, not in the world around him, but within him, a subtle change, like a door closing behind him without sound, and another opening ahead without resistance. The riders did not react, did not turn, did not acknowledge the movement, but the space around him adjusted, as if his presence had been accounted for all along, and she resumed her pace, no longer slowed, no longer creating space, because now he was already within it, and they moved forward together, not as strangers, not yet as something else, but as part of the same quiet motion that had begun long before either of them had stepped into it. And Ethan felt the land beneath his feet differently now, not just as ground to be crossed, but as something that carried meaning he had only begun to sense. And as the town faded completely behind him, disappearing into the distance without a single glance back, he realized that he had not left it in the way he thought he would, not with a final look, not with a sense of loss, but simply by choosing a different direction, and that choice, simple as it seemed, had changed everything that would come after. The rhythm of their movement settled into something that no longer felt foreign to Ethan, and that was what surprised him most. Not the silence, not the distance they covered without a word, but the way his own steps began to fall in line with theirs as if they had always belonged there. The land stretched wide around them, the sun now higher, casting long shadows that moved with them like quiet witnesses, and no one spoke, not out of refusal, but because nothing needed to be said. And in that silence, Ethan began to notice things he had missed before, small details that carried weight, the way the riders adjusted their pace without looking at one another, the way their formation shifted slightly to match the terrain without breaking its shape, and most of all, the way she moved among them, not guiding, not following, but existing at the center of something that did not need direction. And he found himself watching her again, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of a deeper need to understand what he had stepped into. She did not look back this time, did not check if he was still there, and that absence of acknowledgement told him more than anything else could have. She did not need to confirm his presence, because his presence had already been accepted, and that realization settled into him with a quiet certainty, not given, not earned in the way he understood, but simply recognized. They moved across a shallow valley where the ground dipped gently before rising again, and as they reached the lowest point, the lead rider slowed, not stopping, but enough to signal a change, and the others followed without hesitation, their horses shifting into a slower pace. And Ethan felt it immediately, that subtle change in the air, like stepping into a place that held something more than just space. And when he looked ahead, he saw it. Not a structure, not something built by hands, but a natural formation of stone and earth, rising slightly from the land, marked in a way that did not belong to chance. And as they approached, he noticed the symbols again, carved into the rock face, weathered by time but still clear, the same patterns he had seen before, the same ones that had stirred something in his memory without fully revealing themselves. And now they stood here, not hidden, not distant, but part of a place that clearly held meaning beyond what he could yet grasp. The riders began to dismount one by one, smooth, controlled, each movement deliberate, and Ethan followed their lead without thinking, stepping down from the rhythm of walking into stillness, his boots settling onto the ground with a weight that felt different now, more aware, more present. She stepped forward again, moving toward the marked stone, and the others gave her space without needing to be told, forming a quiet circle at a respectful distance. And Ethan found himself at the edge of that circle, not excluded, not central, but present in a way that felt intentional. She reached into her hand, the object still there, and held it up toward the markings. And for a moment, nothing happened, no sound, no movement, only the wind, brushing lightly across the land. And then she placed it against the stone, aligning it with one of the carved symbols. And something shifted, not visibly, not in a way that could be pointed to, but in a way that could be felt, like a breath taken by the land itself. And Ethan felt it in his chest. A subtle tightening, a recognition that something important had just been completed, not begun, not discovered, but fulfilled. The riders lowered their heads again, not in the same way as before, but with a deeper stillness, as if acknowledging not just her, but the moment itself. And Ethan stood there, uncertain of what he should do, because this was beyond anything he had known, beyond any rule or custom he had ever followed. And yet he did not feel out of place, not anymore. He felt included, in a way that did not require understanding, only presence. She turned then, stepping back from the stone, and for the first time since he had joined them, she spoke, her voice low, steady, carrying a tone that did not need to be raised to be heard. And though the words were not his language, he understood enough, not in meaning, but in feeling, that this was not a beginning. This was the continuation of something that had been waiting. And as her voice faded into the air, she looked at him again. And in that look, there was no question left, no distance remaining, only a quiet acknowledgement that he had crossed into something that would not let him return unchanged. And Ethan realized then that this path he had chosen was not leading him back to anything he had known. It was leading him forward into something that would ask more of him than he had ever been asked before. And for the first time, he did not resist that thought. He accepted it, not with certainty, not with full understanding, but with a calm that felt stronger than either. Because sometimes, the most important steps a man takes are the ones he does not fully understand until long after he has already taken them. The silence after her voice did not feel empty. It felt complete, as if something that had been waiting for years had finally found its place. And Ethan stood there at the edge of that circle, feeling it settle into him, not as something he needed to understand, but as something he needed to accept. And that was harder than he expected, because a man can live his whole life believing that understanding comes first, that meaning must be explained before it can be trusted. But here, in this place, that order had been reversed, and he felt it in the way his thoughts slowed, in the way his usual need to question faded into something quieter. The riders remained still for a few moments longer, heads slightly lowered, not in submission, not in ritual alone, but in recognition. And then, without any signal he could see, they began to move again, subtle at first, a shift of weight, a turn of shoulders, the kind of motion that does not break the moment, but carries it forward. And she stepped away from the stone, her hand no longer holding the object, leaving it in place as if it had never belonged anywhere else. And Ethan noticed that, the absence of it, the way her hand rested now, empty but not lacking, and something in that detail struck him. because it spoke of letting go without losing, of completing something without needing to carry it further. The lead rider approached her again, not closing the distance fully, but enough to stand within quiet reach. And he spoke once more, his voice low, measured, and though Ethan still did not understand the words, he felt the tone shift, less formal now, less distant, as if what had just been completed had changed the space between them. And she answered, her voice steady, but softer than before, and for a moment, it felt less like a declaration and more like a conversation, something shared rather than performed, and that difference mattered, even if he could not explain why. The riders began to prepare to move again, some turning back toward their horses, others adjusting their position within the circle, and Ethan felt a quiet tension return, not the kind that warns of danger, but the kind that comes with transition, with the understanding that whatever had just taken place was ending, and something new was about to begin. She turned then, not toward the riders, not toward the stone, but toward him, fully this time, her gaze steady, unbroken, and for the first time since he had stepped into their path, she spoke in words he understood, not many, not loud, but clear. You walked farther than most would, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it was not praise, not approval, just a statement of fact, and Ethan felt that settle into him, not as something to respond to, but as something to hold. And he found himself answering without thinking, his voice quiet, matching the tone of the place they stood in. I did not know where it would lead, and she held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, as if that answer had been enough, as if the uncertainty in it was exactly what had allowed him to come this far. And she turned away again, stepping back toward the others, and the moment between them closed without needing more words. The riders mounted once more, their movements smooth, practiced, and the formation began to take shape again, not as before, but slightly different now, more open, less defined, as if the purpose that had brought them here had shifted into something less rigid. And Ethan remained where he was, watching, feeling the quiet pull of the moment as it moved away from him, not in loss, not in separation, but in continuation. And he understood then that this was not an ending he was meant to follow further, not yet, that his place had been here, in witnessing, in stepping forward just enough to see what lay beyond his understanding. And that was enough, more than enough. The riders began to move, their path turning slightly away from where he stood, carrying them across the land in a direction he could not yet trace. And she walked with them, her steps steady, her pace unchanged, and as the distance grew, she did not look back again, not because she had forgotten him, but because there was no need. The connection between that moment and what came next did not require it. And Ethan stood there until they became smaller against the horizon, until the shapes blurred into the land itself. And only then did he allow himself to breathe fully again, the air filling his chest with a clarity that had not been there before. And he realized that something within him had shifted in a way he could not undo. Not something taken, not something lost, but something opened, a space that would not close again. And as he turned slowly, looking once more at the stone, at the place where the object now rested, he understood that what he had witnessed was not meant to be explained, not meant to be told in a way that others could fully grasp. It was meant to be carried, quietly, in the way a man carries something that changes him without asking permission. And as he took his first step away from that place, he knew that whatever path he chose next, it would never again be shaped by what he thought he knew, but by what he had finally learned to see. The walk back felt longer than the journey out, not because the distance had changed, but because Ethan carried something now that did not exist before, something that made every step quieter, heavier in a way that did not weigh him down, but settled deeper into him with each mile. The land looked the same as it had that morning, the same dry grass bending under the same steady wind, the same distant hills stretching under a sky that gave no answers. And yet none of it felt unchanged, because he was not the same man who had crossed it just hours ago. He moved slower, not from fatigue, but from awareness, noticing things he had passed without thought before, the way the ground held faint traces of movement long after it had gone, the way the air shifted subtly depending on where he stood, as if every part of the land carried a memory that most men never stopped long enough to feel. And when he reached the edge of town, he did not step in right away. He stopped, standing just outside, where the open land gave way to worn fences and uneven boards, and he looked at it, really looked at it. For the first time since he had arrived there years ago, the buildings were smaller than he remembered, not physically, but in presence, like they no longer held the same weight they once had. The noise drifting out toward him felt distant, almost unnecessary, and he realized then that nothing in that town had changed. Not a single board or voice or routine, but everything in the way he saw. It had shifted beyond return. He stepped forward finally, boots crossing that invisible line, and the town received him the same way it always had, with the creak of wood, the murmur of voices, the faint smell of dust and smoke. But beneath it all, there was something new, something unspoken. The people inside the saloon glanced at him as he entered, their eyes lingering a moment longer than usual, not out of curiosity alone, but because they could sense it, the difference, even if they could not name it. The bartender paused mid-motion, cloth still in hand, and gave a small nod that held more meaning than any greeting he had offered before, and Ethan returned it without speaking, because words still felt too small for what he carried. He took his usual place at the bar, the same stool, the same worn wood beneath his hands, and for a moment, he simply sat there, listening to the room. The conversations had returned, quieter than before, but present, men talking about the same things they always had, weather, cattle, small troubles that filled their days, and he understood now that they were not wrong to live that way. They had simply never stepped beyond it, and he did not judge them for that, not anymore, because he knew how easy it was to stay within what you understand, how natural it felt to never question the shape of the world you were given. He reached for a glass, more out of habit than desire, and held it for a moment before setting it back down untouched. The need for it had passed somewhere along the trail, replaced by something quieter, something steadier, and he let his gaze drift toward the door, not expecting it to open, not expecting anything at all, just acknowledging the space where everything had begun. And in that quiet moment, he understood something that had not fully formed until now, that the night before had not been about her revealing who she was. It had been about him realizing who he had been, and what he had chosen not to see. And that realization did not come with regret. It came with clarity, the kind that does not accuse, but simply shows you the truth without asking for anything in return. He exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly, letting the noise of the room settle around him without pulling him back into it. And he knew then that he could stay, live his life the way he always had, and nothing would force him to change. But he would never again believe that what he saw was all that existed. That certainty had been taken from him in the quietest way possible, and replaced with something far more valuable, the understanding that the world holds more than what a man chooses to notice. And as the evening light began to fade into the edges of the room, he found himself not thinking about where she had gone, or what would happen next, but about the simple truth that he had seen something real, something that did not belong to stories or rumors, but to the land itself. And that was enough, more than enough. Because some things are not meant to be followed or explained. They are meant to be witnessed, and once seen, they change the way a man walks through everything that comes after. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different, and that was the final lesson Ethan came to understand. Because change does not always arrive like thunder or leave marks that others can see. Sometimes it settles into a man so quietly that only he knows it is there. And he moved through those days the same way he always had, rising with the light, tending to small tasks, walking the same worn paths between buildings that had not shifted an inch, and yet nothing in those routines felt the same, not because they had changed, but because he had, and that difference showed itself in the smallest ways, in the way he listened when others spoke, no longer dismissing what he did not understand, in the way he watched the land beyond the town, not as empty space, but as something alive with meaning he had only begun to recognize. And sometimes, without planning it, his steps would carry him to the edge of town again, to that place where the trail had begun, and he would stand there for a while, not waiting, not expecting, just remembering. And there was no longing in it, no sense of loss, only a quiet acknowledgement that something real had passed through his life and left its mark without asking permission. The others in the town returned to their ways, their voices louder again as the memory of that night softened into something easier to set aside, and he did not try to change that. did not tell them what he had seen or what it meant, because he understood now that some things cannot be given through words. They have to be witnessed, and until a man steps beyond what he knows, he will not recognize what stands in front of him. And that truth did not make him better than them. It simply made him aware, and awareness, he realized, was not something to carry with pride, but with responsibility. He worked, he listened, he moved through the same days, but every so often, something would catch his eye, a mark in the dirt that others would miss, a shift in the wind that hinted at movement far beyond the horizon, and in those moments, he would feel it again, that quiet connection to something larger than the life he had once believed was all there was, and he would pause, just for a breath, letting that feeling settle before moving on. And one evening, as the light faded across the land, turning the sky into long bands of golden shadow, he found himself standing once more at the edge of town, looking out over the same stretch of open ground. And for a moment, the world held still in that familiar way, the wind soft, the air carrying that same quiet weight he had felt before. And he did not see them, not clearly, not in the way he had that night, but he sensed something, a movement far in the distance, a presence that did not need to be confirmed to be real. And he did not step forward this time, did not follow, because he understood now that not every path is meant to be walked again. Some are meant to be recognized and respected from where you stand. And he remained there, steady, watching the horizon as the last light slipped away. And in that quiet, he realized that the greatest change had not been in what he had seen, but in what he had stopped assuming, that the world was no longer something he believed he understood, but something he was willing to learn from, piece by piece, without forcing it into the shape he expected. And as the darkness settled in, he turned back toward the town, not with the weight he had carried before, but with a calm that felt earned, not given. And the life he returned to was the same in every visible way, but it no longer confined him, because now he knew, without needing proof, that beyond every quiet horizon, there are stories that do not announce themselves, truths that do not demand to be seen, and people who carry more than the world is ready to understand. And sometimes, the only thing that separates a man from that truth is whether he chooses to look twice when everyone else looks away. And Ethan Cole, standing in the fading light of a town that had not changed, knew that he would never again be the kind of man who looked away.